So hello, everybody. I think I'm going to turn it over to Olivia to make some opening remarks.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us here again today. Evening here in Ontario, but depending on where you are around the globe, it may be in a different time zone for you. So we very much appreciate our counterparts from New South Wales joining us here today to talk about infrastructure and how things are evolving in the marketplace. I think that that's a really topical discussion, and so great to have a global viewpoint to discuss some of the trends and challenges that we're seeing, and talk about best practices that are being implemented around the globe, and understand how we may be able to share those best practices to come to good outcomes in the implementation of our various infrastructure agendas, which, as everybody will recognize, are a central and big piece of government policy around the globe today. So so excited to have you all here with us, and we're looking forward to a fantastic discussion today. Back over to you, Rowan.
Thanks, Olivia. I'd like to sort of extend a warm welcome to everyone. This session is going to be moderated by my dear colleague Eric Pleissel from WSP and myself from College Project Leaders, and we're really we're pleased to be joined by Mr. Simon Draper, who is the CEO of Infrastructure New South Wales, who has really been a leading force in the development of New South Wales' commitment to the construction industry. And so over to, so with that, I'll turn it over to Juliet and to Simon, who are going to sort of take us through a little presentation here. So over to you, Simon.
Okay, thanks. We'll just get the presentation shared up on the screen. Georgie will do that now. Just while she's doing that, I'll just acknowledge my predecessor too, Jim Betts, who actually did kick this off. I took over for him about 2.5 years ago, but we had a really solid foundation to start from, and we've taken that a few steps further. So I'll go straight to the first slide there, please, Georgie. Looks like it might be a bit slow moving, but I'll just get started anyway. Look, we've got a very major construction program going on, infrastructure program going on in New South Wales. We have about $108 billion in our infrastructure pipeline, but that's just over the next 4 years. So that's our budgetary period we use in New South Wales. We call it the forward estimates, $108 billion just over the next 4 years. A lot of our projects extend much longer than that. We have projects that run over the course of a decade, well beyond that budgetary period. So the actual number is much higher than that 108 billion. And one of the features of our program over the last 10 years, and it's still the case more than ever, we have a lot of very large, complex projects. I think at one point I counted up not long ago, we had 17 projects over $1 billion going into procurement, and they comprise 27 contract packages. Now, for us, $1 billion used to be a big project. These days, it's pretty run-of-the-mill. We have projects that are in the order of tens of billions of dollars. These projects have very complex elements. They have complex property acquisition. They have very complex in-ground conditions. They're in brownfield areas where there's been settlement and development for many, many years. They have lots of utility impacts, and usually they have lots of stakeholder groups because they're often many linear projects, transport projects going through multiple areas. So they're very, very complex. As you can see from the screen, most of our expenditure is on transport in road and rail, and I think some of the others today will be talking about that. We're also spending a lot of money on hospitals and education, as well as things like cultural institutions, sporting facilities, and other precinct type developments. Thanks, Georgie. We'll go to the next slide. So back in 2018, in anticipation of the task, we set ourselves some goals. And this was done in collaboration with industry. It's called a 10-point commitment. It's more than a guideline. It's a commitment from the government to work with the industry. And without going through that in great detail, it's about collaboration. It's about different approaches to risk allocation, standardisation of contracts and procurement methods, having a transparent pipeline of projects so the industry knows what's coming towards them, reducing the cost of bidding, but also having a bid cost contributions policy, monitoring and rewarding high performance, timeliness of contract payments, and then skills development and increasing industry diversity. And so you might think the first 8 of those are really about the commercial elements of the way we run the industry, but the last 2 are very much about creating a legacy for the future and the type of industry we have and the capacity of the industry. Thanks, Georgie. We'll go to the next one. So Infrastructure New South Wales is the coordinating agency in New South Wales. We lead implementation of that action plan. We have, within government, we have a construction leadership group, and that comprises several agencies, particularly transport, different parts of transport, but all those agencies, health, justice, education, Infrastructure New South Wales itself delivers projects. So we have many, many people involved in that, our Public Works Advisory and several others. We are responsible for making sure we implement those initiatives. And we also run a forum every month where there's demonstration of projects and how they've applied those methods and how it's gone. We do publish an infrastructure pipeline, Infrastructure New South Wales. It's on our website. We published that. That started in 2018. We've published it last year. We've published it again this year, and provides industry with a very granular view of what's coming down the pipe. Other agencies do go down into a more greater level of detail. I know Transport and Health and others do also publish their own pipelines. And we also lead industry engagement. So we work with other government agencies, we work with associations, and we work directly with industry in a number of forums. Thanks, Georgie. One of the things that we've done since that first commitment is introduce a government commitment to avoiding premature project announcements. So the problem with project announcements being made prematurely is they have very adverse impacts on the projects themselves. So we do, of course, in our democracies, get projects announced during the course of election campaigns or in the heat of a political debate. Things will get announced. The problem is if they're announced in a manner that creates unreasonable or unachievable expectations, you risk creating loss of public confidence and political controversy. And that puts pressure on government project teams to try and deliver to those commitments, albeit that they may be premature and unrealistic. And it also puts pressure on industry. So we have a view that you provide incremental detail and confidence across a number of things. So firstly, the solution, the scope and the design, the cost and budgets and the timelines. It's simply not possible to know at the time when a project is a glimmer in somebody's eye, what the best option is going to be, what it's going to cost, or when it's going to be completed. But nonetheless, those elements are often announced at that time. So what we've done is we've got the government to agree, and our government's been in one form or another in governments for a decade, and they've got quite a bit of experience in project delivery. So the government here has adopted this approach, and what we've said is there's increasing certainty and increasing levels of information that can be provided on projects through the stages, from political commitment, scoping options, investigation, business case, the planning consent process, design and tender, contract award, and then finally readiness for service. By the time you get to contract award, you hope you've got a pretty good idea of how much it's going to cost and when it's going to be finished, because you're entering into commercial arrangements with other parties who are proposing to do that, albeit there may be elements which are not nailed down in a fixed cost or fixed time framework. And certainly by the time you get to readiness for service. So we're trying to avoid that level of announcement being made right back at the political commitment stage or even the options investigation stage. And I have to say, the government here has held firm to that approach largely. It's difficult. We often remind them. We all understand that governments have to create a sense of excitement and imagination in the community, but this is at least on the table, and we've taken it through our cabinet process, and it is published as a Premier and Cabinet guideline. Thanks, Georgie. Next one. We also produced a document this year. It's called the Premier's Memorandum for Procurement of Large Complex Projects, because that's where we see our biggest problem. We've got lots of building projects going that are more straightforward in many ways, but we also have some very, very large complex projects, and they're large and complex for the reasons I described earlier: the stakeholder impacts, the in-ground conditions, moving through brownfield areas, the property acquisition. All of those things make them very difficult, and they often involve many, many contract packages which have interfaces as well. So we adopted an approach. We call it "if not, why not." So we've got a set of practices that we propose, and if an agency doesn't want to adopt those practices, then what they need to do is get approval from the chief executive or secretary of their agency to do so, and those exceptions are reported up through government. The practices really go to a few things. Firstly, de-risking projects, so very early engagement with industry to understand what the risk profile, the likely elements of the project which are likely to bring us undone, and the types of procurement that would work on that project. Early works packages, they're now very commonplace in New South Wales to de-risk projects before a main works contract is awarded. We do that on nearly all of our projects, and often the way we shape those packages is influenced by that first early engagement with industry. The procurement approach too is an area of change. So we have proposed a lot more packaging, so breaking down our projects into packages. Now, this is a bit of a case of choose your risk. Packaging means a lot more interfaces and interface risks between contracts. But on the other hand, trying to wrap everything up into very large packages means there's often only a few players who can participate, and for those few players, it's a very big bet they're placing on the table when they take those contracts on board. So we favour breaking projects down into packages to the extent that's practicable. We've also trying to differentiate within our contracts the elements of projects particularly high risk, which is largely the ones I referred to earlier. There are some parts of projects that can still be done. They're relatively easy to predict how they're going to be done and what they'll cost. In a lot of those cases, a design and construct element is perfectly fine for that. But there are many, many elements of contracts which simply can't be predicted with any confidence at the commencement of a project. So we take the view that those should be carved out and treated a different way, and obviously incentivised to get the best possible value for money for the public. We've also encouraged early engagement, not only on the project, the scope and the design with industry, but also on the contract terms, so that the industry knows when they get into a tender process, they've had an opportunity to comment on and understand what the likely risk allocation is going to be in the contract. And also we've proposed recognising international experience and rewarding innovation, because in New South Wales, a lot of these very large projects, we have a number of players who are very well established to do those here, but we also have a number of players who are entering the New South Wales market. They've done these types of projects overseas, but they find it hard sometimes to get their first project in Australia or in New South Wales. So we're encouraging our agencies to recognise that overseas experience, as long as there's the capability in Australia to deliver. And the last element is we're revisiting one of the themes from the 10-point commitment, which is reducing tender costs. So the timeliness and reliability of tender timeframes. We've got a lot of feedback from industry that the timeframes for commencement and completion of tenders blows out. The selection of a preferred tenderer is often dragged out, and sometimes players are left in a tender when it's very unlikely going to win it. So trying to tighten those processes up a lot more and reduce the costs to industry of participating in our tenders. Also reducing the amount of low value and duplicated documentation, and potentially increasing sometimes the role of the state in design and stakeholder management, where there's no particular benefit in asking a contractor to lead those processes. That's only been introduced, that guideline, back in June, but we had been talking to industry for a good 6 or 12 months before that, and we developed this with our own agency, so it's all well and truly being implemented on the ground. Thanks, Georgie. There are a number of other initiatives in progress. I won't read through all of them, but we're still doing work on big cost contributions. We're looking at our financial framework, their insurance, there's claims resolution. There's a whole range of things that are going on. And the last one there, we are looking at whether there's occasionally circumstances where single source procurement might actually present value for money for the public, and also provide continuity for project teams and opportunities to build up capability in organisations. So that's something we're looking at the moment. Thanks, Georgie. COVID-19, for those not in New South Wales or Australia, COVID-19 hit us pretty hard in the middle of this year, the Delta strain, like most of the world. We actually had a construction industry shutdown. So that was new for us because in 2020, we never shut down the construction industry. It's one of those industries that kept going all the way through. But in July this year, the government decided that the Delta outbreak was so out of control that the industry would be shut down for 2 weeks, and then there was lingering, quite prohibitive type restrictions which endured for another month or two. That was pretty hard for the industry, but it also had a silver lining. It did lead us to a very, very deep engagement with industry. So when that hit, we convened a working group, but we called it the Reopening Working Group. From day one, we knew what we were about. We wanted to get the industry back up and running. And it comprised contractors themselves, industry associations from across the board, for large and small and different parts of the industry, as well as unions and our own government agencies. And we worked through the nitty-gritty of getting the industry reopened in a way that would give the government confidence about containing the Delta outbreak. We were very deep in consultation, so we're going between industry and government and effectively negotiating what would work and giving the government confidence if they did something, it would be supported by industry and implemented by industry. On the other hand, giving industry confidence that the government was listening to their concerns. And we spent a lot of time in the nitty-gritty, triaging the types of communications that are going out, making sure that workers in the industry understood and smaller contractors understood what was required of them. And I have to say, it has led to a high level of trust and engagement between government, industry and unions, which may not have been the case had we not been through that experience. One of the important elements of that actually for us was that we did agree some upfront, some commercial principles that would apply to our own projects to give the company, because when you're trying to deal with a wider pandemic issue, the contractors who were exposed and subcontractors who were exposed on some of our projects needed to be sure that they weren't going to be put in a position of financial distress. And so we very, very early on published commercial principles to make sure they understood that they would be looked after through that process. And that provided the headspace and the confidence for us to have discussions about getting the industry reopened. So at one point, we're going to sit down and write the story of what we did then. It was a pretty intense period for us, but I think we wouldn't have asked for that experience, but I think we made the absolute best of it. Thanks, Georgie. Next one. Last slide here is just about turning an action plan into action. There's a number of things that we do. We have a thing called implementation statements. So when our projects go through for approval, they're required to have a statement showing how they've implemented the 10-point commitment. We do our own progress reports against the 10-point commitment and our other measures. We have and I think probably most importantly, we do get a lot of feedback directly from the industry. So we do have industry-led evaluation, and we do have contract performance review system where we go back through and look at the contracts themselves. So there's lots of ways that we examine ourselves on the way through, but I might delve into that a little bit more when we go to questions. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Simon. That was terrific. I think Eric and I are just going to sort of start with a few questions, and then we'll open it up to a little bit broader discussion. But Simon, I mean, the first thing I wanted to ask about was, congratulations on making this commitment, and it sounds like it started back in 2018. Can you expand a little bit about what the state of the market was like before 2018, and what was sort of some of the drivers behind the government wanting to come out and make this commitment in the first place?
Yeah, look, we started on some of our major, really large mega projects in New South Wales back in sort of 2012, 2013. These were coming out of the ground, or going into the ground is probably the better way to say it. By the time we got to 2018, there were a lot more things coming to the market. So New South Wales government successfully executed some major asset transactions in 2015, and that provided a lot of funding for new infrastructure projects, and there were commitments to some very large projects on the way through. And I think back in 2017-18, those deeply involved were looking ahead and saying, well, this is a big job to try and deliver this. How are we going to do it without things going badly for us? That was great foresight, because actually every year things have got more and more intense in terms of project delivery. There are more projects going into the market. The capacity of the industry is more and more strained, and we were looking ahead back then and saying that was the case, but I don't think we really understood how intense it was going to get. The other thing that's happened, I don't think it was so much the case in 2018, but it's happened since then, is there have been a number of projects where government and industry have had a bad experience. So the projects ran over budget. There were commercial disputes around some of those projects. There were contractors who walked away from projects feeling like they had either not made the money they expected to, or had lost a significant amount of money. And so it was no longer academic. People were saying, well, we've got to do things a different way. But I think there was a great deal of foresight by those involved back in 2017-18 to produce this.
Thanks, Simon. And you know, so you're talking about that, about the expansion of the market to really meet the needs of government. So, you know, as you stand today and through your statements that you're making, you know, how has the culture evolved with the market? And, you know, how are you seeing the overall success of that commitment in terms of new players to the market and you know, a good diversity in the market of people bidding projects or interested in projects and getting involved?
Yeah, look, there have been a number of participants who've entered the market. And I'm always really sympathetic for those who've come into the market from overseas with great experience, and they're large companies who've delivered in other places. I mean, I think the first challenge they face, and we want them here, we want competition in our market. The first challenge they face is getting their first project in Australia, establishing some local partners, and demonstrating their capacity on the ground in Australia, because it's one thing to have experience overseas, but unless you've got the people here, that's a problem. The other thing I think is hard is where some of those contractors have won projects, and if they've started to go have troubles, then having to explain to your investors and your board of directors back overseas in your home country that actually, yes, we invested all this money to get into the market, took a long time, we got a project, now it's not going so well. We've hit some problems, and we're not seeming to get a commercial solution on them. That's a pretty hard story for them to tell, and then to persuade their boards to bid for the next project and put up balance sheet for those projects. That can be very hard. So we're very sympathetic with that position. We do encourage them to keep participating, and that's one of the reasons we brought out that guideline a little bit earlier this year. And one of the elements is recognising international experience and breaking very, very large projects up into packages that different participants can get involved in.
Mm.
Well, thank you again, Simon, for making the time. You know, one of the questions I had for you really was around, you know, the importance of all of government project pipeline, because, you know, I know this is something that's debated very often here in the Canadian marketplace. In terms of that all of government project pipeline, you know, what benefits have you seen it have? And, you know, what's the feedback you've gotten so far from the industry regarding that approach?
Yeah, look, of everything we've done, I'd say that's the thing we've had the most positive feedback about. So at the sort of beginning of last year, the back end of the previous year, I had spent a lot of time sitting down with, it's the beginning of this year, back end of last year, sitting down with a range of contractors, tier 1 and tier 2 contractors, and having like one-on-one, quite detailed discussions with them about what was work. But almost to a person, the one thing that everybody agreed on was that the publishing of the pipeline was incredibly valuable. One of them said to us that it was a fairly uncommon thing around the world. It does seem like a fairly straightforward thing to do. The thing that I think we've got to be really careful about is when we publish it, the industry's got to be able to rely on it, because people are investing in their own organisations, their own capability. They're setting aside balance sheet to participate in those processes. It needs to be something they can look at and know they can genuinely rely on it. Because we do put things in the pipeline, but we make, if they're not committed, we make it clear they're not yet committed. They're just there for early, for people's early information. But I think once it gets into a process where we say we've made an investment decision, we're going to run a process to procure it, that's when people really need a high level of certainty about what's the time frame for that happening, what's the process, when's it going to close out, because we've often got a number of procurement processes happening at once. And I did ask the contractors, what if you win everything you're bidding for? Will you be able to do them? And in most cases, they won't. So I think sometimes they're hoping they don't win everything. But sort of providing a level of coordination there, that is certainly the most widely appreciated element that came from the industry.
Yeah, no, and I also really appreciated the comments where, you're working with government and political instances to try to measure the timing of when the announcements come in and the data that's out there. Because as you said, it always gets difficult to backpedal certain promises and schedule and time, and can put all these projects massively under stress and strain.
Yeah, one thing I would say about that element, actually, I should always remind myself that I've said to our own people, when politicians announce timeframes and budgets for projects and they're wildly wrong, they don't make it up. They get it from one of us. So we tell them sometimes, they ask us, what is this project going to cost and when will it be done? And without really thinking what's going to be done with it, we give them an answer that then gets put into the public realm. And I think people in the public sector who are in running projects need to be a bit more thoughtful about that as well.
Yeah, no, great point on that. For another question, I've noticed that the focus of the efforts have really been on 5 areas, and that you've been measuring, performance using data from the projects and on the ground, which is always, important to really be able to have those sort of metrics. Can you speak to them about what you're seeing, what the data collection is, what sort of challenges you've been having, and what are the benefits you're seeing from it as well?
Yeah, look, I think the main measure for us is really for those, a couple of things. For those projects, are we getting participation? So in a lot of cases, we've got so many projects going on in Australia now, not just in New South Wales, that particularly for some of those very large packages, people have got choice. Am I going to participate in this on those terms, or am I not going to participate? So the first thing is just, are we getting people participating in our processes? And the other thing for me that I look for is, are we, as government agencies, are we changing the way that we're procuring after engaging with the industry? So we go out and we do our market engagement processes. And I do see government agencies shifting the way they're procuring, repackaging, changing the way they're going to procure, the risk allocation, all those things that we're seeing them go through. So for me, that's some of the signs that we are hitting the market, and the fact that we're getting good participation in our projects, probably as a result of that market engagement and shifting the way we're procuring. For me, that's what we're looking for. And then projects that are a little bit more advanced, what we do get to observe, because we do reviews of the projects, formal reviews of these projects at different gateways. We do them at we do them at business case, we do them at pre-tender, we do them at contract award, and then we do ongoing health checks on the way through. And monitoring the degree to which the budgets or timeframes for those projects change over that course. We have in the past done that and seen that the cost and the time changes at each one of those steps. It keeps going up and up. But the more that we can have a stable budget and program that doesn't change greatly between those phases. That's another measure of success for us.
Great. No, I appreciate the information on that. And as you've been going through this, what are the big lessons learned that you've been able to draw on from this process? Obviously, it's still evolving and still developing. But up to what you've done at this point, what's the big lesson learned that you've garnered from this so far?
Look, the most obvious thing to me, and it seems pretty simple, is but just genuinely sitting down, genuinely listening to people's problems, and understand everyone's got a position they want to push. That's their commercial interests, but sitting down, kind of one-on-one, and engaging, not necessarily in the context of a particular transaction or contract, but just genuinely talking to people about their businesses and what they're trying to achieve and what the challenges are for them. Look, we found that a really rich and useful process. And the other thing about that that surprised me was that when we've done that, a lot of the people we spoke to said no one's ever done this with us before. Never had that sort of one-on-one where go sit for hours and talk about their business and let them. And we took that away. And I suppose the other thing is we turned that into actions that we talked about within our agencies. We developed those changes with our agencies who are responsible for procuring and delivering those projects. They know most about them, and we found that actually people had goodwill, that there was a lot of knowledge to draw on, and then when we asked people for their views and where better to do it, the ideas came flooding in. I mean, look, a lot of them are not revolutionary, but it's a case of trying to find a way to put them in a structure that people can adopt and implement. The other thing I'd say is that, that one of the lessons for us is that often there is a great will amongst project teams and agencies to make these changes, but they're concerned often that government won't necessarily understand what they're trying to do. So if they've got an element of a project which has, they're never going to know understand the risks of some elements before they get into delivery. But they feel like they've got to tell the government they've got a fixed budget. The idea of entering into a contract where there's a sort of an open book or an incentivized type approach to dealing with those elements of the contract, they find it hard to go to government and get them and Treasury and get them to understand we don't necessarily know how much this is going to cost until we get into it. And are you still prepared to sign a contract to go down that path? So there's a level of kind of political candor that's required to go down that path as well. And as I said earlier, the government here has been in power for some time. People in government have quite a lot of experience, and so we have found it possible to have those sort of conversations.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate the commentary there. We're going to open this up and bring in actually some other people from the public sector, both from Australia and Canada, into the discussion here.
Eric, might it be worth us just introducing the panel?
Well, that's what I was about to say. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, great.
All
right. So I'll do. How about it, Eric? I'll do the Australians and you do the Canadians.
Yep.
All right.
Sounds good.
So we're joined today by Damien Ottavino, who's a director in the Construction Leadership Group. We're joined by Matt Crocker, who is Director of Origination for Plenary Group. We have Richard Sharp, who is a principal for ARAP. Scott Ney, who's the lead for the Transport Practice New South Wales for WSP. Camilla Drover, who's the Deputy Secretary for Infrastructure and Place Transport for New South Wales. And we have Juliet Economo, who's the Commercial Leader for Clients and Markets at Laing O'Rourke. So welcome to everybody. I hope you've had your breakfast. Eric, over to you.
So from the Canadian side, we have Matt Clark, who's the Chief Capital Officer with Metrolinx. We have Charles Van Niekerk, who's the Executive Vice President for Transit with Infrastructure Ontario. We have Olivia McCangus, who welcomed us all earlier. We also have Magda Sabat, who's the Vice President of Pre-Construction with Pomerleau. Gareth Jones, who's the Infrastructure and Urban Rail Lead with ARAP here in Canada. So just finishing out their day on this side. So the first kind of forum I think we're going to have on the panel here is going to be discussions, some questions around the public sector, and then we'll be opening it up on the private side as well. So you want to kick it off, Rowan?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So my first question is to Damien, in light of everything that we've heard from Simon this morning. And sorry, before we jump into this, Simon, I know that you have to jump off in a couple of minutes, so feel free to hang along for as long as you're available, and when you need to go, feel free to drop off. But before you go, if we don't get an opportunity, thank you so much for joining us and spending the time with us. So to Damien, I would guess the question is sort of, what's your experience in how you've corralled these different government departments in working together and seeing sort of an all of government thinking in sharing of approaches? Can you sort of share your experience with how that's sort of been?
Yeah, sure. So the Construction Leadership Group itself comprises all the key executives, like people from Camilla's team, and they're at a very high level. So they're at like CEO, deputy secretary level. So those kind of discussions are very valuable, and they set the direction for the group. So that's been, the main kind of driver for getting change happening, because we've got those senior leaders in the room, and it's across all agencies essentially. But what I do as a director is kind of corral the next level down and try and get those people on board who report into those senior leaders, and that's really where we get kind of traction on the ground. And we meet quite regularly. We have one-on-one discussions. We have group meetings as well. But it's really kind of driving things in and embedding them into people's BAU essentially at that level. So it's kind of a two-tiered approach that I use.
And do you think have you seen a noticeable improvement over the years that you've been doing that and going through that process, or has it been an evolution and just sort of it's different problems with different names?
Yeah, look, everyone's busy. So, this program of work that we're running is massive. It's unprecedented. So, everyone's really busy and trying to just deal with the wave of work that's out there. So, yeah, I think it's been a gradual improvement over the last couple of years, where we've had some, the ability to kind of tackle things as progressively. So not trying to bite off everything all at once, but just slowly make those inroads in over time and focus on some things that we can really deliver, rather than trying to tackle all of our problems, because they're big problems that we're trying to deliver against.
And sorry, just one last question and we'll move off, but just that change that you're seeing, are you feeling that change is sort of becoming embedded within the understanding of how government and the industry does work together, and will this sort of lead to a lasting change? Or is it sort of tackled in terms of, well, here's the procurement model we're using for this project, and so we'll resolve the issues on this project, and when a new procurement model comes along or a new project comes along, it's a whole new set of things?
Yeah, look, in the public service, you do have people coming and going. So the consistency of personnel is always the challenge. And yeah, we can rely on a procurement policy or a guideline, but it's got to be front and center and kept relevant. Despite the changes of personnel and changes of machinery of government, changes even within government agencies. And so it's really just kind of driving and being consistent across government in telling the same stories, and making sure that we run these case study forums and showcase where all the good practices and really keep it front and center. We have a website as well where we publish a lot of information, and we do that publicly. So we're constantly talking to industry as well. So despite the kind of changes that occurred through industry, if we keep everything relevant and front and center and keep progressing, and I think it is an evolution. And I know you asked before earlier, what's the measure of success? How do you know that you've achieved the 10-point commitment? And I think it's constantly evolving, really. And we every year set our priorities based on the new challenges that we're facing, and do the best we can. But I think it will be a job for life to try and deliver this 10-point commitment.
Thanks, Damien. Appreciate it. I'll turn my attention to Camilla now. So, one of the things that we noted with Transport for New South Wales is you've put in place a customer satisfaction index, looking at all forms of transport, trains, buses, vehicles, cyclists, pedestrians, those types of things. Can you sort of tell us what kind of impact that's had from your experience, and sort of what kind of, how this is sort of all tying into this commitment to industry?
Yeah, thanks. So the
Have we lost Camilla?
I lost the audio as well.
Okay. Sorry, Camilla. I think
we're having some technical difficulties.
yeah. Camilla, we might come back to you if that's okay. Eric, do you want to maybe move on to the next set?
Yeah, I'll move on over to Matt Clark here. Matt, you spent some time in Australia. Were there any approaches that were common that you'd like to export to Canada, or anything that you heard of that could, benefit the marketplace here in Canada, Ontario? Things that you've seen of particular note that as we're kind of trying to make the linkages here that would be important to underline.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, my time in Australia was all on alliances, actually. So it's definitely around that collaborative contracting piece. And yeah, I think as people in Canada and Ontario are seeing, we're definitely shifting into that space now. We're moving to more progressive contracts, moving away from fixed price where it works and where it's relevant to that target price model. And certainly what I saw in Australia around the early contractor, the early supply chain engagement, the use of development stages to mitigate and manage and properly allocate risks. I mean, that's huge for us, and that's exactly where we need to be. And yeah, we're shifting into that space now. We're just coming to the end of our first Pure Alliance development stage, and that alliance was based very heavily on the New South Wales model, and that's been a real learning experience for us, but really successful from my point of view. We saw exactly the behaviours we wanted to see through that development stage process, and it's been an incredibly interesting experience for all the people involved, for Metrolinx IO and the supply chain partners. So yeah, I've just been listening for the last 45 minutes, and a lot of what you're hearing from New South Wales teams, it's just resonating very strongly with where we're at. It just feels like we're a little bit further back on the journey, but definitely trying to head in the same direction with better market engagement, better pipeline engagement, and as I say, huge focus on collaborative contracting.
So far, having gone through collaborative contracting in the Canadian instance, just because I do know that often, there's questions if the industry is ready for it, and it is a shift in thinking. What are the key takeaways you've seen so far in terms of how that's been moving forward, as you're saying, as you're going through this kind of first major alliance in the civil space?
I'll speak broadly and then specifically, I suppose. Broadly, yeah, we definitely see it as a huge challenge. It is a shift for us as well as a shift for the industry. We've really got to focus on education, driving behaviours, driving a culture, all of those sort of fundamentals to moving into a more collaborative space. What we've seen on the alliance that we have gone through, we've seen all of the behaviours that we would have hoped for, and we've seen a really fantastic engagement from the industry. And what we are also seeing, as I'm sure people are aware, is as we're shifting towards progressive contracts, target prices, we're seeing a huge amount of interest from the supply chain, a huge amount of interest in the market. Again, I heard the statement earlier around market participation being absolutely key when you're undertaking a huge portfolio of work. That's exactly where we're at. We need market participation. We want people to come and want to work with us in our space, and we're delivering huge projects in a very complex environment, exactly the same as we're hearing from New South Wales. We need good market participation, we need early contractor engagement, and we need these models to work. And we're certainly seeing uptake in the market at the moment as we're shifting. So that's great. And as I said, definitely something we're very focused on, making sure we are driving the right culture and the right behaviours, and educating and training and learning as we go, and all that sort of good stuff. But early indications have been fantastic on the projects that we have undertaken.
Excellent. That's great to hear. So seeing that there does seem to be a promising future where you're looking there, where else is Metrolinx kind of looking to create an environment that encourages partnerships and collaboration beyond the ones that you're currently looking at? And is there other sectors or niches that you're exploring as well?
Well, I mean, from a Metrolinx point of view, obviously we've got a pretty big portfolio to deliver, and we are looking at every area of the program, our packaging strategy, our contracting strategies on a sort of case-by-case basis, and we'll use the more progressive contracts where it makes sense for us. We're certainly in the space of doing more qualitative assessments through the procurement process, the use of behavioural assessments, as part of our selection process to engage with single partners and then work with them going forward is going to be really key for us. We've used that now, not just for alliances, we're going to be using it for progressive contracts, but also we're engaging with delivery partners. We want delivery partners to be working with us and helping us deliver the specific areas of the portfolio. And we've looked at very qualitative ways of selecting the partners we want to work with. And we want to use the same models that they use in New South Wales and Australia and alliances around incentivizing performance and putting profit at risk against performance against areas that are important to us as a client and key performance indicators that represent the areas where we need high performance from ourselves and the supply chain. So there's lots we're learning at the moment, lots of changes that we're going through. It's an exciting space.
Yeah, no, definitely great to see all the changes here. I don't know, Rowan, if you want to try see if Camilla's audio is working again.
Yeah, Camilla, you're back with us?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Success.
Yeah.
Well, so just maybe to reestablish, I think the question we were sort of looking at was around the customer satisfaction index, and sort of having a qualitative and quantitative assessment of performance in that manner. Can you sort of talk to us a little bit about how you've sort of seen that change things in the last few years?
Yeah, so we have had the customer satisfaction metric in place for a number of years, and we do it across modes. So everything from roads, freight, light rail, heavy rail, metro, even active transport, cyclists, pedestrians. I think the fact that we've got a metric in the first place is a big statement. It reinforces the fact that transport is about providing services to customers, and we're sort of pivoted to make sure the organisation is very customer-centric. The fact that we've got the metric too means we can look at trends, and it was interesting during COVID actually to see where some of the trends went and what customer sentiment was about travelling, for example, on public transport. But we actually saw a customer satisfaction fall for active transport, people walking and cycling. And we're still trying to assess what that was, but perhaps it was because more people were out walking and cycling and looking at our infrastructure and perhaps suggesting that it wasn't quite up to scratch. So I think having those hard and fast performance measures is really important, but it's also a big statement that we are that customer-centric organisation. Just, Matt was talking about collaborative contracting, and I know that's not my question, but just a comment on that. At Transport for New South Wales, we're absolutely doing alliances, incentivised target contracts, even construct-only contracts with elements that are fixed price or target cost. But even where we're doing D&C, fixed price, fixed time, we're still approaching it with a collaborative mindset. So there's a number of things we're doing on the way through. So it's not the form of contract, it's the behaviours that's driving that partnership approach. So interactive tender processes where industry can bid back, perhaps the technical specifications or technical departures, as well as the commercial departures. So that's an opportunity for greater collaboration. Health check-ins on the way through. Co-location of teams, client teams, verifier teams, contractor teams, all in the same office, fully integrated, co-located. So there's a whole raft of measures which adds up to that sort of partnerships approach, which is well beyond the form of contract.
Thanks, Camilla. I mean, talking about co-location here in Canada seems a little bit odd from the last couple of years that we have, but I think it raises a good issue. Is this collaboration comes by being around each other, right? So, Thanks, Camilla. I mean, Eric, do you want to? We'll go back.
I can move over and have a couple of questions here for Charles. So, just a question for you regarding what we've been hearing about here. Is there anything that struck out to you about the approach we've been hearing about New South Wales that you'd be keen about hearing more about or see advantages to looking how we can kind of apply it to the Canadian context?
Thanks, Eric. I think what stuck out most was the similarities between the New South Wales approach and our own strategy. And that's a great thing because we do need a more consistent approach. Considering that there seems to be a massive global boom on infrastructure investment. I mean, our own program here in Ontario is about the same size as the New South Wales program, in the 100 billion ballpark. And we seem to be reliant on the same supply chain in many cases. Simon already mentioned publishing the pipeline has had a big impact, and we have the same experience here when we publish our pipeline. So what would be great to hear is what else has been most impactful, and perhaps on the flip side, what's been the biggest challenge to implement the new program?
Maybe Damien, would you have a comment on that?
Yeah, certainly the things that Camilla mentioned around interactive tendering and early contractor engagement has been really critical in terms of changing behaviours and mindsets. I think industry really appreciate the conversations and the input that they can have early to drive the innovation, and not for us to not be so prescriptive. The other thing I think that's been really important, I think, has been the bid cost policy and the bid cost contributions that we pay along the way as well. So, we can reward contractors for providing us with their input into the projects, and that will just deliver better outcomes for us. As we don't know, we don't have all the answers as a government agency, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I don't know, anything else, Camilla, you wanted to add to that?
You asked me about performance scores and metrics to do with customers, but the other thing we're doing is actually rating our contractors, and we're sharing that data across the agencies. So that's a fairly recent innovation. But the fact that the health delivery agencies and the schools and transport looks at all this data, we can start to see, are there themes, and we can address those themes. And it's also a good basis to have a discussion with a contractor about their performance scores and where we're seeing good behaviours, less good behaviours. And I think that the next evolution will actually be rating ourselves, or industry rating the various delivery agencies, so that we can have a two-way conversation about each other's performance. But that's again been a really tangible metric that we can use to improve performance on the way through.
Well, are you suggesting that contractors start rating government?
Absolutely, it's got to be two-way.
Yeah, well, I think there's a few would appreciate that opportunity.
Yeah.
Well, I think they always rate us with their participation in our bids.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what Simon said earlier does go to the step change we've made in the last 5 years. 5 years ago, it was difficult to get 2 bidders for some projects. Now we're, getting 3 on a very regular basis, and sometimes 4, we're having to turn 1 down. But we're also not seeing the level of claims and the scale of some of the claims and problems that we perhaps had 5 years ago. So I think there is some really hard, fast data that says we have made some significant improvements.
Camilla, is that reduction in claim correlated against overall project budgets?
No, what we're seeing is we're not seeing the massive losses that we perhaps saw 5 years ago.
Right.
And we're not seeing claims of $1 billion generally across the board. And I think that's twofold. I think we've changed our approach and the way we procure, and the more collaborative approach. It's also we're more mature. So we have built a capability and a capacity in New South Wales and Australia. So the industry is getting better at delivering these more complicated projects. So, we're now delivering, we're halfway through sort of the Metro program, which we hadn't built previously. We're about to procure the 7th underground tunnel motorway, which again, we hadn't built one of those for about 15 years prior to this recent sort of bout. There's a whole range of infrastructure now where we're getting to a degree of maturity, and that's adding to the skills and the capability and the capacity in the market.
Okay. No, and it's as I said, listening, a lot of the issues you were talking about, seeing reduced bidding, seeing increased claims, is definitely where we've kind of seen the Canadian marketplace in the last few years, and obviously trying to move it along. One of the interesting things I found that you said, Camilla, was trying to infuse kind of the collaboration mindset, even if you're in a D&C, design and construct type contract. Charles, a question maybe for you is, is that also something you're looking at? Because I do know we're looking at Alliance and a whole bunch of other procurement models, but kind of changing the overall philosophy, within the marketplace in Ontario.
I think it always comes down to matching the right delivery and approach to the right project and risk profile, and that's the key here. For example, when we're adding progressive delivery, it's not a shift in focus to progressive delivery, it's more adding it to our menu of delivery models available for us to deliver. Definitely a bigger focus on collaboration, but I must say, I think we tend to focus on policy or delivery models to try and establish that collaboration. I think that's the wrong focus. We need to start focusing more on the culture. It's more about the people in the room and the attitude they have to solve issues. And that's where our focus needs to be, on shifting the culture of our staff, training, etc. Whether you're delivering a fixed price P3 or an Alliance or a progressive DB, or what we call now in Ontario progressive P3, where you start with a development phase that ultimately leads to a fixed price P3. We need to get the mindset shifted of our staff and the contractors.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. I think it's about getting the mindset regardless of the model, because in New South Wales they do use several models. How do you think you get about that and start transforming the minds in the industry to start doing that shift?
I think it's leading by example and top down. At the executive level, we need to set the example for our staff, and as an owner agency, we need to set the example for the contractors. We just have to establish that culture within our own organization, and hopefully our partner organizations will follow suit.
Great. Olivia, anything you want to ask to the panel here?
Just throwing me on the spot. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. And I think, one of the things that's really interesting about this market that, we see has kind of followed suit from other markets that are a couple of years ahead in sort of or have been a couple of years ahead historically in adopting new delivery approaches, is really this notion that, a big part of it is response to market. And that, this is a big driver for evolution of the different procurement approaches and the way that we're thinking about delivering infrastructure. And I think that, from where I sit, having been part of the implementation of infrastructure policy for quite a long time in Canada, one of the drivers for us nationally has been sort of these successive waves of especially federal policy around investments in infrastructure and what that's been driving at the provincial and municipal levels. And the fact that we are seeing now a move, and also, obviously our communities are changing, the needs of people and the needs of our economy are changing also. And so what we are seeing is a drive towards like these large scale projects, which, are newer for this market. We certainly weren't seeing that a decade ago, that's for sure. So it sounds like that experience has been pretty similar. What have been some of the catalysts of changing the relationship between owners and your delivery partners from the sort of, it sounds like you had quite a similar situation where you were into risk transfer contract models, and then there was some market pressure there, and as you moved into kind of bigger delivery, bigger program delivery, you needed to think about sort of different models to get your agenda delivered. What have been the catalysts of changing the relationship? And I'm not sure who would be best placed to answer that, but I maybe throw it open and see if anybody has any ideas.
I'm happy to make a couple of comments and then perhaps some others. I think no form of contract is going to solve the problems of a project if we haven't done the work up front. So that's another shift. A lot more focus on early engagement with contractors, not just to understand how they want it packaged or what form of contract they want, but actually to share the risks and say, look, here are the risks that we think there are on this project. What do you think about that? But also, how do we best share them? And based on how we're going to share those risks, that will inform how we package and also the form of contract that we're going to adopt to deliver that. So much more early work about mitigating and managing the risk as opposed to just trying to pass it to someone else. A lot more work on, utility investigations, geotech, contamination, all those sorts of issues, because that's where we see the problems. So I think it's doing the homework up front. In the behaviour space, I think the other feature is we've got many more people from contractors coming into government and vice versa. That's been a healthy dynamic, I think, because some of us see the perspective of the contractor and have stood in their shoes, and vice versa, people coming out of government and going into contractors. So I think more of that is actually good, because that breaks down the barriers, more willingness to engage, more willingness to work together and have a more collaborative approach on the way through. So I think there are two factors that have contributed to the issue.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wonder if Matt or Charles, you kind of have some views on that, and maybe wanted the opportunity to talk about it, because I think that is a direction that you're taking, especially around the planning. I mean, we certainly know that 5 years ago, when the massive program of transit was announced, it was announced and much of the planning had yet to be done, right? So, there was not really a strong knowledge of where those interfaces were going to be. I know there's been quite a lot of work done by Metrolinx and IO to think through, how we address that on a go forward basis. And my understanding is that you've made quite a bit of progress there. Yeah,
I'll have a go, and then Charles can put it probably better than I do at the end. But no, I'm totally on board with what Camilla's saying about the effort that goes into the front end of these contracts, and where Simon was at the beginning of this presentation around spending a lot of time really understanding the packaging strategy and then understanding what the right contracting model might look like. Also agree with the statements that were made. I talked a lot about collaborative contracting, and that isn't the be all and end all. We've had some fantastic results with our tunneling packages on the subways contracts. They weren't collaborative contracts, they're P3 with a huge amount of work went in with the industry to get the risk transfers right, get the amount of the contracts right, get the early works and assessments and the geotech and utility investigation baseline documents and all that sort of stuff that were just mentioned in the right place to enable those contracts to be successful. And they're getting off the ground now really, really well, or into the ground, as Simon said. So yeah, in exactly the same space, we're doing a huge amount of work now to make sure we're prepared to get into these contracts. We're not sticking blindly to deadlines for getting out to the market. We're doing the hard work up front. I still think development stages are a huge tool in the toolkit for that. I think they're actually working collaboratively through those development stages with the market, whatever the contract at the end of that process might look like. But having that early contractual involvement, working around risk mitigation, risk allocation is just incredibly important to us. And yeah, much more around the approach and the behaviours at the front end of those contracts than necessarily the contract form.
I fully agreed, Matt, and I think there's no substitute for proper preparedness or contract readiness for procurement. I think the key here is not so much to have a project perspective, but start having more of a program perspective, especially considering the amount of projects in procurement you have out there. I think, Matt, what was the last count? We had over 200 projects, quite big projects in process. Sometimes that does force us to stage the work differently, where you might put a procurement out before you're absolutely ready for that procurement. And that's also where the development phase comes in handy, where some of that contract readiness work can happen with the contractor once you've selected that delivery partner in the development phase. Because you kind of have to weigh up the proper staging of the work to make sure you don't overload your market with the different procurements, while still making sure you've got everything in place for the procurement.
Yeah, great insights on how things are developing here as well. It is, I think everybody recognizes who's in the market that it is a market in evolution, and it has been for about 15 years now, and probably was before that too. And so it's fantastic to be able to draw on the experiences of countries who kind of are a couple of years ahead in that maturity curve, which is fantastic.
Excellent. Well, we'll open up maybe to some people on the private industry side of the equation here. I got a question here for Matt Crocker. As as someone who's worked for the Premier of New South Wales, I'm sure you're very well acquainted with the political side of government. Have you been able to see a shift in the political landscape on how these changes have really prioritized performance, as we've heard, and how has that trickled down, and what have you seen that as kind of the real life on the from the plenary perspective of what all of these changes and these commitments have resulted on the ground?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Thanks for the question. And look, I'd say it's been one of the hallmarks of the New South Wales government over the past 10 years, that kind of question about long-term planning and not just planning but delivery. And if you look back in the history of New South Wales, there was a kind of track record of projects being announced and cancelled, either because the planning was poor or the money wasn't there. So, from the political side of things, we put together our structure based on really three things: really strong and integrated land use and infrastructure strategic planning linked together, including the establishment of Infrastructure New South Wales, where we shamelessly borrowed some things from Infrastructure Ontario. And secondly, a funding strategy to make sure that we could deliver on what the city and the state needed, including asset recycling and budget controls to make sure the money was there. And then finally, that sense of a really deliberate focus on customer service and customer outcomes as part of our infrastructure strategy. And that was everything from making sure that the services were clean and pleasant to use, and making sure we thought about things like interchange and how the system overall would work together. And I think the other point on that kind of linkage between the political side of government and delivery was a really strong sense of common purpose and respect between political leaders in the political office and the delivery agencies in New South Wales. And I think that sense of common purpose and partnership was really important in delivering what continues to be a really ambitious agenda over 10 years. So I think they were the key things in driving it, and certainly endorse everything that both Camilla and Simon have said about the using a collaborative approach to make sure you get the outcomes that we all need.
Excellent. No, appreciate that. Thank you very much, Matt.
Well, maybe just to follow on with Juliet, with Lang O'Rourke from the constructor side as well. Can you just maybe share some of your thoughts, sort of following on from Matt there, about the experience that you've sort of seen since 2018?
Yeah, sure. Look, and I've been pretty lucky because I've actually done both sides. So I'm one of those people that Camilla spoke about who's moved from contractors, so from private sector to public sector, and then back out to the private sector again. So I've had quite a bit of experience with the 10-point plan from both sides of the table, if you like. And certainly since its introduction in 2018, we've seen an enormous improvement in terms of how projects are managed, how we interact with government, and how they are brought out into that procurement space. But I think it's important to say that this isn't a static sort of scenario. So yes, we've seen a lot of progress, but the world that we were in 2018 when the 10-point plan came out is a very different world and a very different market that we're in now. And not just because of COVID, I think it was already a very hot market, but now we've got more and more competition with even just nationally from different jurisdictions. So the east coast of Australia is incredibly busy with its infrastructure programs. And we've got government clients that are competing with each other for contractor input and participation. So it's a really interesting dynamic. And I think what we need to really have a look at now is how we take the 10-point plan and evolve it to its next stage, if you like. So where industry is almost really keen to actually see a 10-point plan Mark II. So not to drop off the first 10 points, because they're absolutely vital and critical to how we operate, but to take it to the next level and have a look at what happens with the overall project life cycle. So from what you would have heard today, the 10-point plan is very focused on the very early stages of the project. So it's development, it's getting it through that procurement, bid cost reimbursement, talking about what delivery model, risk allocations. They're all things that happen right at the beginning before the contract is awarded. What I think we need to have a look at now is what happens once that's awarded, how do we actually engage with each other? How do we really cement that collaboration that we need and that ability to then, when things do go wrong, and they do, how do we actually deal with each other in a more pragmatic, realistic way to achieve what are the right project outcomes? So as many panelists have pointed out, the contract model won't, it'll go some way in setting the behaviours, but when things get tough, people tend to revert to what they know. And if you haven't got the experience and the training to deal with those disputes, then you will revert back to lawyers at 10 paces, and that's not helpful for the project. So how do we get in there early? How do we build that relationship and that trust so that clients can call out issues if they see them coming, but similarly contractors are actually not afraid to see around the corner and let their clients know that this is going to be a problem. Let's work together now to try and fix it before it becomes something that's really out of hand.
So that's really interesting, and about kind of bringing it in, because you're right, this is really about kind of the whole kind of getting it to market, getting it awarded, and then of course there's the rest of the life cycle. So obviously, I've heard a lot that it's really a change of philosophy, and it's a change the way people are approaching this. So how can the private sector, the construction industry, how can they be key drivers to kind of push that piece into the kind of like 10-point plan 2.0, as you're talking about, to drive that one forward?
We need to have trust, and we need to have open communication. I think somebody else has called that out already. So we need to make sure that from both sides of the ledger, if we're raising issues, they are taken seriously, and the other party can see that it's being acted on. So if we've got to have market engagement and early market engagement, and we're going to talk about risk allocations, let's have an open and frank conversation about what that looks like, and then when you get that input, let's be really open about what you then do with it, because you don't want to get into a situation where you've got this amazing 10-point plan, but all you're doing is ticking a box. And I just want to be clear, I'm not in any way suggesting that the New South Wales government is doing that, but you've just got to be careful that you are actually doing something material with the inputs that you're getting from industry. Having said that, it is very much a two-way street. So just as industry will be vocal about having an open, a transparent, and a collaborative government client, industry similarly needs to be open, collaborative, and transparent in its dealings with government, because otherwise we're just not going to get the right outcomes. So that really means that industry needs to not aggressively price contracts so that they are effectively bought. We need to be pricing the infrastructure fairly and competitively, making sure that we are assigning some value to things such as innovation, technology, learning and development, training of apprentices, doing things for sustainability, and all of those key things that are critical at the moment for our infrastructure sector. And behaviours such as ambit claims at the end of your contract in order to recover the items that you've underpriced or purposely not priced, that behaviour has to stop.
Yeah.
Julia, I mean, that's fascinating. I think I'll turn to Magda now to provide some sort of Canadian context on that. Is there a lot that you can sort of feel is present here in the Canadian market, Magda, and does the idea of a 10-point commitment sound appealing to the contracting market?
Yeah, thank you. And actually, I would like to touch on further on what Juliette has been speaking about. We're talking a lot about behaviors, changing the culture, being collaborative and partnership approach. And Juliette touched on a very key item, having both sides have to come to the table and work through the issues and work through the risk together. But I'm really curious to actually hear lessons learned from our panelists from Australia about taking that 10-point plan. And I want to focus on this, adopting this partnership-based approach. And yes, behaviors are part of it, but at the end of the day, the contractor who's bidding for a project is looking really at the commercial terms of the contract, and really looking at what are the terms in there and what we'll be working with through the implementation phase. It goes beyond participating in the procurement structure, but in the execution of it. How will we be able to actually collaborate based on the terms that we have in the contract. And you know, Canada's evolving, and we're moving through, as Charles outlined, through the progressive P3 or alliance projects, as Matt Clark was speaking to. But you'll find, you know, the conversation is around, let's collaborate and have a partnership. But that's sometimes not always reflected truly in the commercial terms. There's still a lot of terms that, you know, when you're reviewing it, when you're bidding the project, you're saying, okay, how will this actually play out in real life, in execution? What tools will we have available to us versus the owner side? And just, you know, it would be really interesting to hear how's that, the challenges in implementing that principle of collaboration into actual pragmatic contractual terms, how that's going, and what maybe there are lessons learned that that we can take and adapt in Canada.
Well, thanks, Megan. So, okay, well, maybe we'll deal with this in two ways. Maybe Juliet, would you like to give a response? And then Matt, would you like to give plenary's perspective on that? And then after that, we'll turn to Scott and to Richard, more from the design perspective, who sort of work with a number of different consortiums.
Sure. Look, it's a real challenge. There's no doubt about it, and I think it's going to become more so of a challenge in the next sort of 12 to 18 months as we see more and more complex projects come out into the market, and the resourcing constraints that we currently have mean that people, personnel with less experience are going to be moving up the ranks, if you like, and managing these really, really large, complex projects where, when issues arise, the consequences, the financial consequences, are actually much bigger than previously, thought. So it's a huge challenge. I think it comes down to, it does often come down to the people that you're dealing with, how experienced they are, how mature they are in their approach, and their relationships, right? So if you want to be able to have that trust, so that you can actually go to your client and say, this is an issue. This is an issue now. It's going to get a hell of a lot worse in a few months' time. How do we work together to resolve it? Yes, we've got the contract, and yes, we've got dispute mechanisms in there to help us resolve it. They often come in far too late. So we need contractors and clients with experience in delivering projects to actually work together cohesively to meet the project's outcomes.
And and certainly from a plenary perspective, as a P3 or PPP specialist, as we call it here in Australia, certainly recognise all of those challenges and that sense of trying to be intelligent and sophisticated on the risk allocation, and work collaboratively with government and contractors to resolve some of these issues. So I think there's a really good path forward, and I think there's also things that we in the New South Wales and the Australian market can pick up from some of the work that Charles and Infrastructure Ontario are doing, particularly around that progressive PPP space too, and those innovations in the model, which are going to deliver both better outcomes for government and a more sustainable industry overall.
Like Richard, and maybe do you want to weigh in with some thoughts at this point? Being the designer, we know that you're always to blame for everything. How have you sort of seeing this change in the market?
Yeah, it's really interesting to just observe the change of culture. And certainly 15 years ago, industry was just very vocal in calling for a transparent pipeline of projects. I think it's fair to say that's been delivered, and I think very well received. It does make things visible. It makes things discussable. It probably enhances the opportunity for collaboration even between different arms of government. So if we think about transport developments and the precinct developments that might accompany them, I think the visibility of the pipeline has been a real asset, and government is to be commended, I think, for delivering that and for sticking with it and keeping it updated so it remains credible. There's certainly a challenge in communicating, I think, what's in the pipeline and why it's in the pipeline to our government representatives, but that's worth doing. I wonder Absolutely, I'm seeing a more collaborative culture across the industry. In my dark hours, I wonder whether that's just a consequence of this being a period when there's more to be delivered than there are people to deliver it. Might that change when the situation's reversed? But I hope not, because through this process there has been much more interchange, as Juliet has said, between industry and government. That's been an asset. I think there is a growing diversity across industry and government, and government being quite intentional about that. Transport is being very intentional. We have a property client who's being extraordinarily intentional about the way that they create diversity in design teams and delivery teams as a very conscious effort to start to change some of the entrenched cultures in the industry. So I think those are very positive things. I think we've got a few challenges beyond delivering what's in front of us. I think there are a couple of challenges. One is a suitable level of equipping with skills and training across industry. The industry is terribly stretched, but surely we can use this peak of work as an opportunity to upskill across the sector. And then we haven't talked about building in pathways to net zero carbon, but that is a very pressing need for all of us. Doesn't matter which country we're in, probably an existential challenge. So in all of this change, that's something that has to become part of our business as usual. So I guess, Rowan, those are the sorts of trends that I'm seeing at this point.
Thank you. And yeah, as you're saying, it's just in the recent months, priorities and everything have been changing. So as you said, it's maybe goes back to what Juliet's saying as part of that 2.0 is seeing how do we start bringing in these other commitments between resiliency and climate change that need to be integrated into the projects themselves. Scott, just kind of building on what we've been discussing, you know, one of the realities is being the designers, you tend to be upfront on a lot of these projects, right? You tend to be the front of the project and very much involved in the procurement, in the development of the procurement. You know, I've heard quite a bit here from New South Wales saying that they've been looking at streamlining the procurement. And have you been seeing that in terms of the way we've been chasing projects, delivering them? And you know, have you seen these sort of benefits across departments, and what are the advantages you're seeing kind of to the designer on the upfront kind of development stage of these projects?
Yeah, thanks, Eric, and good morning or good evening to everybody. It's quite interesting. I think, first of all, just agreeing with what everybody said. There's a lot of very common themes across this, and so I'll run out of things to say very quickly, I think, because it's already been discussed. I think one of the things to note about where we are in the market, it's become what I'll call is a much more selective market, where, you know, the people are taking the opportunity to really look at what's priority to them, look at what's important, where you can make the most impact. And I think in terms of how it's operating now, we've seen a lot of opportunity for us to really get in on that ground floor and really work through the whole of life development on some of these, especially these big mega super projects. And I think, you know, we talk about having resource constraints and a huge pipeline of work. I think that's been one of the really satisfying things for us as an industry and us and our people as well, in being able to really start in the infancy of projects and really work the whole way through, but looking at it in a way where you can probably influence much more. There's words around, you know, just the language that people are using around the opportunities, not just the risk and opportunity, but the opportunities and the risks that we can drive forward with. I think the opportunities are out there. COVID as an opportunity is something I've been hearing a lot about lately, and how we can help drive that pipeline. And really, COVID has helped to, I think, identify and accelerate that collaboration and the need to be more collaborative across how we are delivering our contracts. I think probably the other thing that, you know, it's been touched upon, but I think I just want to say the culture, people, and attitude, I think was talked about before, really focusing in on that people bit, and really congratulating transport and, you know, our contracting partners on the leadership around that, because it has to be led from the front. And then it does take those individuals to be brave, to change those cultures. And you know, I've seen a lot more of where ourselves as consultants who sit, you know, 2, 3, 4 tiers down in terms of the contractual structure, but really being brought up into those teams. And, you know, that trust has been built, those relationships has been built. And on those projects where that's happened, we really are getting those best outcomes, you know, for the people here.
Thanks, Scott. It's really interesting to hear that. And maybe I'll turn to Gareth to maybe share your thoughts. Do you sort of see that kind of being brought into the projects earlier and being able to influence them from a design perspective happening here in Canada, or is it something that we still have a bit of a road to run on?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it is a bit of a road to actually build upon. But I think it's to take some of the global key examples from a infrastructure New South Wales or transport for New South Wales, and to pull these actual best practices to the local market. So whether it's based on an ECI model or the Project 13, I think it's just, I think it just makes sense. I mean, this is a partnership, but the whole market is on a journey to actually achieve a desired outcome, and it's a two-way street. And there are some very good value to having that actual dialogue as a way to actually de-risk projects and do the actual due diligence around a project. I think it's also a very important element to do that ECI or the early involvement in terms of the actual technologies. If you think about these mega projects, they're actually being planned. Planned and delivered sometimes over 10 or 15 years. So where is the actual world going to be? What is the actual technology? And to get the input from the actual technology supply chain as well. So I think it's a cross spectrum in engagement needed to actually cover all of those key areas on actually the planning and the delivery of projects. But if I could ask a question to Damien. So, the 10-point plan is great, but I'd be keen to learn about how you've seen your actual neighbours, neighbours in Queensland and also in Victoria, because in a similar way here in Canada, we have, we have the key provinces. They're all competing to get the A team. Have you seen any sort of positive feedback or some actual competition, say, from your colleagues down south or north, said, wow, this actual 10-point plan, because we need one in Queensland perhaps, or in Victoria, or have you seen any feedback from the actual market said, wow, it's worth for the market to be more engaged perhaps in New South Wales because of this advancement of the 10-point plan?
Well, unfortunately, there's no one from Victoria, Queensland to counteract what I'm going to say, but I'd say that they'd probably look at us as an exemplar. We do have regular dialogue through the Construction Industry Leadership Forum, which is a joint participation between the Australian Constructors Association and Victorian governments, and hopefully soon we'll get the Queensland government on board as well. And we do regularly talk and meet and discuss the challenges. I guess they probably don't want to just copy our 10-point commitment, but certainly the Infrastructure Australia agency as well often talks about the 10-point commitment as an exemplar way for us to engage. But I mean, because we're regularly engaging across jurisdictions anyway, and we're all facing similar challenges, we're sharing as much as we can across jurisdiction about what we're seeing and learning. And you know, we are a national market, even though we are a federation of states. It's just a historical legacy of the way that we were founded, but we do have the same problems. We're working with contractors across the same, you know, the pool of opportunities for us to do business. So I think the main thing is just we keep the dialogue up. We share, we talk very regularly with our Victorian counterparts through SILF and share insights wherever we can. To try and drive the outcomes that we're all trying to achieve. You know, productivity has been a key problem in our industry as well, and you know, that 10-point plan version 2, maybe that can be an Infrastructure Australia plan that we all sign up to, including all extra things that we put in. I mean, the 10-point commitment is pretty silent on sustainability, environmental sustainability, for example. Yeah.
Thank you, David.
So Gareth, there is the Victorian government's public construction framework, and it's actually very, very similar to the 10-point plan. And I believe the Victorian government actually sort of went out to a lot of New South Wales industry to get input as to, you know, what the Victorians should see put into their framework. And it's yeah, very, very similar. We're finding that more and more, you know, dealing with the various governments, you know, including Queensland government, we can actually start to pitch ideas that are coming from other jurisdictions. So this is what, you know, we could go to the Queensland government, for example, and say, this is what is working really well in Victoria right now. You know, why can we pilot something along these lines in terms of, you know, a new delivery model? And they're quite receptive to that.
Yeah, for sure. You know, I just think of the ARTC and the Inland Rail project, and you know, and actually, you know, actual challenge of getting, you know, a similar theme of a similar key goals of a 10-point plan in a project which actually goes across 3 states. And also in Canada, you know, we have a planned project called High Frequency Rail, which is 1,000 kilometers long, passenger rail across 2 provinces. But how do you actually translate those similar 10-point plans on a interstate or an inter-provincial program? Very interesting.
I would have thought, Gareth, if the foundational principles of what's trying to be achieved are true for one, they're true for most, right? I don't think there's anybody that doesn't want to see an open and competitive and diverse market, right? So while there'll be differences for sure, and maybe some people will not acknowledge or recognize challenges in their market, I think the foundational core of what they're driving at is going to be fairly similar. Absolutely. But it is an interesting point. We've had a question come in from those listening in, maybe just to talk about some of those differences between the rural infrastructure versus urban infrastructure, which do face some really, really different challenges with labor force, supply chain, logistics, even pricing can be quite difficult in those. You know, I open the floor to those who maybe want to take a pass at how that's being addressed.
I'm happy to make a comment, and I think it's a doubly important question post-COVID, where we've asked ourselves questions about national sovereignty and manufacturing capability and all sorts of things, and what that might mean for regional development. We've seen people voting with their feet in terms of cities and regions. I think one of the underlying challenges that we've not really addressed is understanding how our infrastructure is actually performing. So, you know, when we look at metrics across different sectors and different jurisdictions as to what it means for a road system to be performing well or a rail system to be performing well, there's a remarkable inconsistency, in my opinion. And a lot of those metrics are either inputs or outputs. They're not outcomes in terms of customer satisfaction. So Camilla's spoken a bit to that, and I think that's a really important step. But the customer expectations, whether it's reliability and safety of water supply or reliability and safety of a rail system, I think they need to play a larger part in the way that we think about infrastructure, the way that we understand how our networks are performing, and then using that as a basis for making our investment decisions about, okay, well, are we going to invest in upgrading this part of the water network next, or this part of the rail network, or this part of the road network? And for me, that would create a more transparent environment for these sorts of decisions, so it doesn't become an urban and rural debate. It just becomes a discussion about, well, where is the need in terms of customer service expectations? So that's a point of view.
I would echo some of that commentary. I think that one of the things that we, when we think about the work that we do, we think about supporting our clients across the built environment, right? So that, we're really talking about, you raised the point, Richard, about networks, but networks are really what we're talking about. A piece of infrastructure is one piece of infrastructure, but the reason we're typically building that infrastructure is to see it tie into a network and tie into the activity of our communities. And that could be rural communities and it could be urban communities. I think one of the things that we see across our, we've got over 30 offices across Canada, and they're not all in big cities, right? Most of them are in smaller communities across the country. And we do see a disparity in the access to some of the planning resources outside of sort of major metropolitan areas. We do see the same pressure on the infrastructure in terms of sustainability, the need for sustainability, the impacts of climate change, the change in our culture in the past 20 years, and the way that people are thinking about themselves in the built environment is changing quite a lot. And so when we start to think about that, it is one of the areas where smaller communities are, I think, really starving for some road mapping of, what do we need to think about in terms of the next steps? What are the foundational pieces that we need to put in place? Where do we get that information? And it is one of the areas that where some of the larger metropolitan areas are certainly further along in the planning, although also have much larger networks to have to address, right? So, we did go for 50, 60, 70 years without the critical investment in our networks, especially in the urban areas. And that really shows in the way that we're now having to try and catch up quickly, and also the evolution that we're trying to kind of accommodate through the investments that we're making.
And maybe just to add to that from a labour force perspective as well, I think particularly for rural projects, the last thing you want is a fly-in, fly-out workforce that leaves nothing in the local community. And so much of what you want to do in a rural project is skills development and economic development in the region. And I know on projects that Plenary have done here in Australia, in regional communities, that's a big it's a big outcome that you drive, making sure that you use local workforce, and importantly local contractors as well, because you build up their capacity and their ability to bid for larger projects from there. And on the procurement side, often one of the best ways of doing it is to build it in as part of the procurement process too. So the government agency is looking for those kind of outcomes and making sure that that when it's assessing approaches, it takes into account that local economic development and that local skills usage, and the legacy that you leave afterwards as part of the procurement process. And that's worked really well in a number of projects here in Australia.
I think, if I may add, there's a risk that head contractors need to be really, really cognizant of when they're engaging with a supply chain in the rural communities and some of those smaller contractors. And that's around the solvency piece. A lot of these contractors, they want a piece of this pie, as they should, and they want to get engaged, but they do start to become engaged in a lot of projects and stretch themselves very, very quickly. and don't always have the experience and the knowledge to manage the cash flow issues and the forecasting and forward planning that's required in order to build this machine that needs to be built in order to manage this in a sustainable way. So we do see in New South Wales a high propensity for smaller businesses to come undone as a result of that, because they're going into these projects not necessarily their eyes fully open. So I think there's a big role for government to play here to make sure that smaller businesses have got access to the resources that they need in order to properly educate themselves and understand what their rights and obligations are, so that they can, manage some of those issues that come from, especially from a cash flow perspective, being able to manage that. And in that vein, we have an office of the Small Business Commissioner who did an enormous amount of work on that training piece, and that was extremely well received from the small contractor cohort.
Well, excellent. Great discussion. We have another question that we've gotten as well from the audience here around, the fact that collaborative contracting, obviously, especially in the Australia market, is become well established and is becoming kind of a model that everyone understands and knows kind of how it works. The question we have here really is to ask the panel, what do you see as kind of the next advancements and where contracting and delivery is going to be going in the future beyond the models we have today? Are we seeing any tendencies, anything that would be moving this forward in the future here? Tough question.
It was Matt who posed it.
I might add a couple of things here, maybe that might stimulate some responses. So Sydney Metro here, our agency delivering the new automated mass transit system, trialling an initiative that came out of the Construction Industry Leadership Forum, where we did an early identification of risk with industry, and it was a staged approach where instead of talking one-on-one with industry, we got them together in the room, all together, to talk about the risks of the project, and that helped shape the commercial frameworks for the project. So I think that was a bit of a insight into what the future could look like in terms of how we engage with industry early on, and we were a little bit nervous about the approach, because we've kind of heard stories that won't work, because when you get everyone in the room together, they're not going to want to share their insights because that's kind of their commercial advantage. But we went through this process, and it was quite successful, and there's some lessons that came out of that, and the Sydney Metro have been trialling on further contract packages as a result of that experience. So I think it was proven to work, and that could be a new model going forward. It doesn't have to be just on the mega projects. You could even look at doing that on smaller projects as well. The other thing that Camilla touched on was the two-way contractor and or the two-way performance loop that is being trialled by Sydney Metro as well, around driving conversations between the project teams and the executives of the contractors and the clients to get kind of early indicators of where there might be problems. So it's an assessment tool around so the perspectives of the contractor on a certain topic versus the perspective of the client. And then where there's variances in those perceptions, you get a red flag. So it's not necessarily just about time, cost, and quality, but it's about all the other factors that lead to good performance and good behaviours. And it's really a behavioural-based tool. It highlights where there's variances. Those variances get reported to the executive, and then you get those conversations happening really early about what maybe the problems might be and how that might be uncovered before it becomes a dispute or becomes a problem. So I think they're kind of the things that we're looking at, and maybe trialing them a bit further and sorry, there's one more thing I wanted to mention actually, and it's around culture of the industry itself, and that we know there's our industry is fraught with a very bad gender balance. For instance, that's just one of the problems, but also the long hours, and it's commonplace for people to be working 60, 70 hours a week, and that has an impact on the culture and behaviours of our whole sector as well. So we're looking at a culture standard that's being developed at the moment, which is available for public, it's published at the moment and is available for comment, and it looks at time for life, mental health, gender diversity, and potentially some innovations around reducing working hours of people's to give them time back in their lives to do other things. So it's I don't know, it's going to take a while to get that to happen, but we'll see how that goes. There's just 3 things I wanted to mention.
So Damien, just a question on that, because I do find it interesting bringing in some of the some ESG concepts. And one thing I've heard a lot of people talking about is looking at that triple bottom line. Is there in the future of projects, as I've heard it a lot, and I haven't quite seen it in a procurement. And I'm wondering from that question if anyone has any thoughts on are we going to evaluate projects differently, not just what their cost is, but what's the environmental benefits and what are the societal benefits? Obviously, it's going to be interesting to see how you get a scoring sheet around that. But I think, we've been talking how, the world has changed pretty rapidly, and we're going to be held to account to a lot more than just the project itself, but the outcomes. Any thoughts on that, Damien, or anyone else in the group?
Well, we are looking at value for money and redefining value for money at the moment through our Construction Industry Leadership Forum, and that's one of the things that we're kind of exploring. I guess the governments always have a million different outcomes we're trying to achieve in our projects, which does make it a little bit hard for industry when they've got shareholders and a commercial kind of outcome to achieve as well. So it's a really tricky area to kind of nail, and it's not just value for money through the initial procurement process, it's through the whole life of the project and the asset life as well. So I guess that's the challenges we all face as infrastructure experts is balancing the public expenditure of our taxpayers' funds, trying to deliver on the myriad of social outcomes and environmental outcomes, all the other outcomes, and still making sure our industry is thriving and making money and making and being able to invest in their own businesses and training and capability of their own people. It's not an easy topic.
Well, so it's not an easy topic, but one maybe I'd like to turn to Matt Clark and Charles, who are, they live and breathe value for money and have ministers to answer to, specifically on this topic. How do you sort of see this progressing in our marketplace?
Yeah, the same space that we were just talking about, really. I mean, ultimately, we need to be very, very clear about how we're going to assess the value outcome of a project at the end. And we need to do that at the outset of the project. We need to do it working with the supply chain partners so that we're being very clear on a much wider spectrum than just cost and schedule performance. What's important to us as a client, what's important to our stakeholder, and what's important to, important factors that are driving the expenditure of the public money. So absolutely front end definition of what will define the successful outcome of a project is incredibly important in a structured way that will then be working through the project and reporting back to ensure that the project is delivering on those outcomes. So yeah, it's very important, not something we're doing enough of at the moment, but it will certainly be absolutely key as we move into that more progressive space.
No, absolutely, and the focus should really be value and benefits management. I think sometimes people equate that to cheapest price, which is not the case. It is really about what value do you get for that money spent, which may not always be the cheapest price out there. It's benefits delivery.
Richard, I see your hand up.
Yeah, it's an important point because it works both ways. So government is progressively building other factors into the traditional business case methodology, and that's appropriate. But not all infrastructure is delivered by government funding alone. There's an enormous amount of private capital in both our countries and globally. And those infrastructure investment funds are being driven by sets of global ESG standards, which are continuing to develop. So they are constrained in what they can invest in, and they will be looking for opportunities that align with their broad set of aspirations. So it does work both ways, and I think in a sense the private capital market and government continue to challenge each other. Hopefully it's a healthy tension, but it's absolutely essential that we move that way.
Thanks, Richard. Olivia.
Yeah, I was going to say that, you know, one of the things that we do see with these networks that are being built, especially with the transportation network, is just what a catalyst it is for our communities, and the way in which our communities are actually growing and developing and changing. And so, you know, I think that it is really interesting to me that so much of the focus on the kind of 2.0 list for New South Wales is really tending more towards, I would say, ESG kind of drivers, right? Because these are areas where in a single project context, sometimes it's quite difficult to actually measure the impact that the project is having, or you know, where the dollars are going and tying those directly to sort of the ESG impacts. But I do think that, you know, the way in which we procure and the way in which we think about these things is a massive driver of the change that we need to see in our communities. And so I think it's really interesting that conversation is coming up. I think it's really interesting that it's being tied into, you know, how we think about value for money, which, you know, we've been talking about for many years as, you know, maybe becoming a bit of an outdated way of thinking about it, and that needs to evolve over time. Fascinating discussion. It'll be interesting to see what the outcomes are and to see how, you know, you drive that much bigger change in terms of, you know, how the communities are responding, how they're shaping themselves, what you get in terms of environmental and social outcomes from those investment dollars if you tie that in.
Thanks, Olivia. Look, we're coming up on time here, so you know, I'll leave it to Eric to maybe have the last few words, and maybe over to Olivia to sort of wrap us out. But I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for participating in it. Obviously, there's a conversation that could go on for many hours, and to those of us who are in Toronto, probably it will. But from my perspective, thank you so much for joining us. It's really, really interesting. Eric, over to you.
Great, thanks, Rowan. And yeah, no, I just really want to echo Rowan's comments. As I said, I appreciate everyone taking the time. I know we're all very busy, and I think we're also sick and tired of Zoom calls, but this is a great way to connect continents, which was always more difficult before. So it was great kind of seeing the dynamic. And I'm always fascinated on these discussions, because the more you kind of hear about different parts of the world, the more you actually realize the similarities are so much more than anything of the differences. So I really do appreciate everyone's time joining the call and spending their time in this discussion, as I said, which I found really absolutely fascinating. So thanks again. And with that, I will turn it over to Olivia to bring us home. You're on mute, Olivia.
I know, the curse of COVID. All right, so thank you everybody for joining us here today. So happy to have you all. And I want to, in particular, thank Rowan and Eric for guiding our discussion today. I thought that was a great sort of migration through all things infrastructure related, and we covered a lot of ground. I'd also like to thank our panelists for sharing their insights. And I thought that it's actually fantastic when we're able to bring together best practices and people who are facing the same challenges from around the world. And this is the third of a series that Future of Infrastructure Group has hosted. I think that they've been very well received, and they've been very insightful and given us a lot of content and insights into some of the things that we ought to be thinking about in the Canadian context. We are going to be pulling together a brief summary of this event, and the recording is going to be available on our website. So for any of your colleagues, friends, contacts that you would like to forward it on to, please feel free. So that'll be the Future of Infrastructure Group website. And we look forward to continuing this dialogue with New South Wales in the future, continuing to learn from each other. We hope that you will share with us the outcomes of some of the initiatives. And I think that we'll probably be reaching out because we've got the Future of Infrastructure Group. We've got quite a number of initiatives underway. It sounds like you may be doing things in a similar vein. In the meantime, I think we're going to let everybody get on with their evening or their day. And thank you once again for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.